Just a quick disclaimer, before I show you any of this game or the others I'll be talking about in this video, I wanted to let y'all know that there will be many scenes of blood, gore, and disturbing imagery. It'll be pretty difficult to talk about this game, as well as horror in general, without showing that kind of content, so this will be your one and only warning on the subject. There's also going to be a few scenes with flashing lights and quickly changing colors, so please take that into account if you have epilepsy or other seizure-inducing conditions. You have been warned. This video contains heavy spoilers for the Callisto Protocol and its Final Transmission DLC. So before we get on with the meat of this video, there's a couple addendums I need to tack on here in regards to the first video I released on this game. If you haven't seen that video yet, I'd encourage you to see it before watching this one, as I'll be touching on a few points I mentioned in that one here today. Don't worry, I'll still be here when you get back. If you go through all of that though and make it back here, maybe consider subscribing to show your support. Obviously you must like something about my channel if you sat through an hour-long discussion on a poorly received video game and came back to see the second part. The first thing I want to bring up is the name mispronunciation I did with Dr. Mahler. When I created that video, it was one of my first with the long form content mentality, so I recorded all my scripting through the editing software and did it all in one take. If I fumbled my words, I didn't do much to fix it. There are speaking mistakes everywhere in that video, and it's kind of embarrassing. Anyway, the scientist's name is Dr. Caitlin Mahler, with an M. She's a secondary character in this game, and her personality isn't really touched upon until the DLC, but she plays a major role in the events of the franchise. I mispronounced her name multiple times in direct reference to her. She plays a larger role in the DLC, so I'm gonna go out of my way to pronounce her name correctly this time around. Also, I incorrectly referred to the secret cult group as the Order multiple times in the story segment of that video, which is also just painfully wrong. The group that Cole and many other Black Iron scientists belong to is called the Circle, and consists of a bunch of dudes wearing gold masks and speaking in Latin when they want to refer to anything important. Also, in regards to the game as a whole, I need to admit that when I played this game, I didn't get around to actually playing it until making this video, which happened in January of 2023, a full month after the game released. I didn't pre-order this game and I didn't play it on console. I bought the PC version through Steam and made my video after several patches and bugs were fixed. This whole process definitely gave myself a bit of a bias when making that video, as after posting that video, several people pointed out to me that the game launched in a terrible state with many graphical and functioning bugs polluting the entire experience. So I suppose a little bit of clarity was in order after all of that, since I didn't get the game in its launch state, and that definitely would influence the way I perceived the game in general. Finally, I just wanted to touch on what I said toward the end of that video, where I said that no DLC had been spoken of in that time. This is also kind of misleading, but let me explain. At the time of making that video, the Callisto Protocol was balls deep in patches and promotion. The game as a whole was on the market, and people were talking about it. Striking Distance Studios did announce that there would be DLC content, like cosmetics, but the main story DLC wouldn't come until much later. The announcement trailer came on June 16th, with merely a week's notice when Final Transmission dropped on all platforms on June 29th. At the time of making that first video, the story DLC was merely talked about in the community. There was little to no communication about when or where it was coming, and I think a lot of that was due to the fact that the devs were running around trying to fix bugs and errors in the base game while waiting through the mixed reception for their game. Still, we eventually got the DLC anyway, which rounded things out in making a closing chapter to Jacob's story. Final Transmission is strange. Like, it's definitely great in quality. The combat scenarios are intense as always, and since everything takes place after the events of the main story, the enemies here all swing in for at least 2 or 3 times, making them an engaging and threatening encounter every time. Even the blind get their turn chasing down the player, which for me was a great moment. Getting to spend more time inside the actual halls of the prison was also really fun. I feel like in an effort to make things interesting and not feel so samey, the devs made a lot of varied environments that stopped feeling like a prison after maybe like 2 hours. Which is fine. I think it would have been a lame move to have over half the game take place in gray steel hallways. Getting to go outside in the snow and falling to the depths of the facility where everything is covered in fleshy goop was refreshing. So it was really cool to see that Striking Distance did their best to make the levels in the DLC feel similar by changing certain rooms to look more destroyed and taken over. Going through familiar looking hallways that have something just noticeably different about them made the whole thing more creepy. That's also something worth noting here as well. This DLC is obviously working to make you scared of it. The introductions of hallucinations using in-game assets is scarily effective. The sequence where you run into Elias in the prison cells was surprising and genuinely made me nervous. Just when I thought the scares were delivered, only to have the bit go on for just a bit longer to unsettle my nerves. The hallway scene after you obtain the kinetic hammer, where you're barraged by an endless wave of mutants, absolutely freaked me out. The constant flood of them pouring in, not being able to actually discern what was real until they either hit you or you swung through them was truly impressive. Every turn through this hall, I kept praying it would be over, but they kept coming and I kept sweating. I was genuinely concerned I'd have to start all over again, but it ended before I actually had a panic attack. I mentioned it a little earlier, but Striking Distance decided to give us a new melee weapon in this DLC, the kinetic hammer tool. This thing rocks balls. It wails through the standard enemies easily and has a ground pound move that wrecks things in your immediate vicinity. It's pretty impressive how many of these dudes fall to even like 1 or 2 blows from this thing. You feel pretty indestructible against these guys right up to the hallway of 1,000 zombies, which I think is where the pressure in the DLC mounts the most. That or this one room in the garbage disposal area where you get barraged by a medley of standard mutants and the addition of the new enemy forces, the Biobots. These guys are kind of unique, I guess. They're security bots that, through video game science logic, have fused with the biophage to take over the facility. The bots are still as intimidating as before, giant hulking hunks of metal patrolling certain areas that are sensitive to sound. Once they find you, they keep pursuing you until you're either pulverized or you take them apart. They take damage through normal means, but the gunshots and stun baton do noticeably less damage in combat versus them. You're forced to fight a single one head on in the campaign to demonstrate how weak you are compared to them. Then after this stupid timed puzzle trying to sink this moving lock into place, you're given the hammer to absolutely desecrate these abominations of science. From there, you're pretty overpowered right up until the end. Final Transmission serves as a capstone to the story being told at Black Iron. Things were left somewhat ambiguous with the ending of the main campaign, and while I don't think that was necessarily a bad move, having some closure come out as DLC definitely serves multiple purposes here. With the mixed reception this game got from the audience, I'm glad that they were at least able to have the ending to Jacob's story in this universe. There's a sneaky little plot line going on here that definitely got one over on me, and I appreciate the way they told this story. Jacob starts back at the bottom of the Warden's Tower, in the solitary experimentation cells where Mahler was leading her research. He's contacted by the doctor and told he's suffering from a dissociative amnesia because of the trauma he's undergone during his adventure through Black Iron. Mahler has decided she's going to chase a form of redemption for leading the terrible program in the prison, so she needs Jacob to make his way to a ship in the loading facility on the other side of the prison while picking up her digital diary detailing her research and Cole's directives. The first one's found in her old lab close by, so he meets her there in holographic form to get get a map of where her old workstations are. Jacob is then forced to navigate the facility a second time, wading through the new enemies and returning to places in the prison now destroyed by the biophage and the self-destruct sequence that Cole initiated before he fled at the end of the base game. Mahler managed to re-engage safety protocols, but the damage has been done. The prison is going to implode, and Jacob and Mahler have to escape with their data before it's too late. Easier said than done, like any good horror experience. Mahler's diaries detail Cole's ambitions from the start. Cole took advantage of Mahler's creative spirit and her lust for knowledge, and pushed her over her own ethical boundaries. Eventually, she just wanted to prove Cole wrong no matter what the cost, which led to the drastic and despicable events behind closed doors. She even went out of her way to launch a side project, the Biobot Initiative, to determine if machines were going to dominate humanity in the future instead of nature. After her experiments spiraled out beyond her control, she sealed the labs and buried the project, which only came to light during the facility's destruction. At the end of her plights, she developed a deep-seated regret. She ended up proving Cole's theory and developed the biophage. She set things up perfectly for him, and there was no turning back. All that was left was to assist him in manipulating events at the prison, or she would be subject to the same experiment she spearheaded all of these years. Jacob would soon arrive at the scene, which worked miraculously against everything Cole stood for. His will inspired Mahler to own up to her own mistakes, to attempt any kind of forgiveness for her sins against humanity, and get as much information to the world as possible before Cole could act on his ambitions. Jacob experiences the prison in a new light. There are no more humans alive at Black Iron except for Jacob and Dr. Mahler, and the facility is crumbling down around him from the power failures. His only hope of survival is assisting the scientist in one last job against the Callisto Protocol. The ruined version of the prison complex proved as difficult a task as ever, as Jacob is constantly forced against odds well out of his favor. Hordes of mutated inmates, malfunctioning technology, unstable structure, and mental breakdowns plague his journey. Several times, Jacob finds himself trapped in scenarios conjured by his fractured mind, chasing phantoms and his inner self confronting the atrocities he's committed. Mahler's robotic voice has to take him out of these several times, urging him to continue his fight. When Jacob finally makes it to the maintenance area before the loading bay, he faces off against several enemies who absolutely obliterate Dr. Mahler in front of him, but as Jacob approaches the spacecraft, she appears again, this time as a horribly mutated version of herself. Jacob is forced to put her down, beating down the scientist, now a victim of her own research. Jacob makes it to the spacecraft, which he strangely recognizes as the cockpit to the same one he flew in on in the first place. With a radio transmission from Mahler urging him to take off, Jacob hops in and begins the launching sequence of the ship. After successfully taking off, the screen turns to white. Jacob comes back into view with a bright light shining in his face, which pans away curiously to Dr. Mahler herself, perfectly fine, examining him closely. She speaks to an electronic diary, recording and transmitting her notes. In the distance, you can hear explosions and falling rubble echo throughout the prison. Mahler says that she's been using Jacob's core to transfer her diary recordings through his link with Danny, and as she looks back to Jacob, the player sees his body completely broken, severed from the waist down. His face mimicking that of his friend Max, torn away on the right side and barely hanging on through the tubing and unknown liquids being pumped into him. The transmission of Mahler's diaries finishes just in time, as she sighs and her arms fall to her side as one more explosion booms and debris begins falling onto the laboratory, crushing the doctor and her final patient. That's right, this entire DLC is a hallucination sequence, a chemically induced coma dream. Everything the player goes through in Final Transmission was dredged out of the consciousness of the dying half of a man who'd been through disgusting and harrowing trauma. Dr. Mahler had been manipulating his body from the very start, which is in line with her character as we've come to know her. And with this, we can peel back the layers on what this final chapter was trying to tell. For me personally, I see a story of redemption, or at least the wanting to achieve it at any cost. Since the DLC takes place entirely from Jacob's perception, we can filter the events through his mind. Leading up to the events of the Callisto Protocol, Jacob was working intentionally ignorant to Cole's plan, spreading the contagion to an unknown number of planets just to make a decent amount of money and hopefully retire early and safely. After seeing exactly what he'd had a hand in doing at the end of his journey through Black Iron, Jacob made the decision to change for the better. He sent Danny off into the world with additional knowledge of what he'd done and what he felt about it. But in his dying exhaustion, it's seen that Jacob wanted to do more. He was always willing to atone, he just needed to be given the chance. So he conjured one in his own mind to live out. Jacob's dream in the final transmission is him working with a person who he inspired to be better. He justifies Dr. Mahler's change of heart by making himself the crux of her newfound purpose. He relives memories of going through certain parts of the ship, people and places that he'd already seen, but warping them to accommodate the new scenario that would have been brought forth by the self-destruct sequence being initiated and then cancelled. So Jacob fulfills his fantasy. He becomes stronger, more resolute in his goals, and attempts to achieve redemption. But his failing mind on the outside is playing tricks on him. He knows deep within that the vile acts he committed don't deserve forgiveness. He said it himself. He belongs here at Black Iron. So his conscious, rational mind keeps trying to poke holes in his fabrication. These manifest as Elias reminding him that he helped a murderer escape from his cell. He gets trapped in a never-ending loop that leads him right back towards his only opportunity to escape, showing that he possibly regrets not having taken that pod. All of the scrawled blood messages on the wall, damning him for getting people killed and robbing people of their lives and well-being. The entire time, Jacob is chasing a freedom that he denied himself, no matter how optimistic he was about survival. Jacob Lee belongs at Black Iron, no matter what state or prison he's in. This is his new home, and it will also be his grave. He saw to that himself multiple times. This story is batshit insane, and I kinda love it. Having the entire thing be a fever dream of sorts while his body rots away, sustained only by the crazy machinery from a scientist not afraid nor ever repulsed by her own actions. Dr. Mahler says that she wanted to use Jacob as a conduit for redemption, but in the end, the methods she ended up doing it by were no different ethically than what she provided aid to with Cole and his ambitions. People have a hard time finding change within themselves. Whether the words mean anything in the end depends entirely on how hard they fight by them. It's a nice thought to think that Jacob Lee could escape from this hell come to life and work to redeem himself by fighting off Cole in the Circle. It would have been incredible if Dr. Mahler had released her research about the biophage to the public and some resistance group formed around her to counteract the Circle on multiple different planets, letting her gain her repentance for her actions. But honestly, those are just pipe dreams. Nice little fantasies that they can dream about while the world comes crashing down around them. Jacob and Mahler did terrible things in this story. Their actions aren't so easily forgiven, at least not according to the game's lore. And I think that's really fitting, especially to the game's message. In the PT-esque looping hallway sequence, Jacob gets jump scared by the holographic message from Cole explaining to him about escape, about how this prison and the turmoil within himself is inescapable. The only path towards true freedom is found within. This line, or rather this whole speech, really, is the perfect summation of Final Transmission. Jacob couldn't live with the terrible things he had done. He recognized that by the final confrontation with Cole and his alpha, but there wasn't any way for him to act on it. That's why he admits that he belongs at Black Iron. He's unable to escape his reality, and he will have to live with it for as long as he can. If Jacob is going to find freedom of any kind, it's going to have to come from within. Beneath his personal strife, below the consequences of his will, is his true freedom. The redemption he wished he could breathe into life rests within his soul. Jacob will only ever find inner peace. His mortal shell, his body and his mind, are at the mercy of Black Iron now. He will be there through his dying breaths until the very end. All Jacob can do now at the end of the line is find the peace within himself. At least then, when he does die, he can do so with the dignity and respect he should have held onto from the very beginning. And nobody can take that away from him, at least, no matter how hard he's brutalized. Not Ferris, not Cole, not Danny, and not even Dr. Mahler, who never learned the lesson that Jacob did. He may have been a tool until the very end, but Jacob Lee will at least die of clear mind. So, what does the Callisto Protocol look like 1 year later? Well, for starters, to soothe the majority of the player base, the game has a complete ending. The game doesn't pull a Halo 2 anymore and save the final arc for a sequel, you just need to pick up the DLC. I said in the first video that the ending to the base game is pretty good, and I still stand by that. The ending for Callisto Protocol sends up a branching path for future games in the series. If people liked the character of Danny more, they could have made a sequel playing as her and align more with her group. If the people liked Jacob more, they could have made a sequel where he and Mahler teamed up to fight against Cole and the Circle by themselves, like a space-aged philanthropy from Metal Gear Solid 2. Either of these would have been great, but people had major complaints with the cliffhanger ending. So Final Transmission solves that little problem by giving players a tragic but realistic ending that fit with the main game's themes of will and consequences. That in of itself isn't bad. If anything, it serves as a more well-rounded finish line that'll serve well with the real-world state of Striking Distance Studios. As I'm sure a majority of you guys know, but if you don't, I'll explain it anyway, Glenn Schofield is no longer a part of Striking Distance. In September of 2023, Schofield announced that he'd be leaving the developer voluntarily, along with the Chief Operating Officer Stacy Harada and Chief Financial Officer Johnny Sue, in order to pursue new opportunities, as they put it. In addition, Striking Distance laid off another 32 employees of lesser rank after production on Callisto Protocol as a whole wrapped up. According to Game Rant, at launch the game sold 2 million copies across all platforms. While nothing particularly to scoff at, the projected sales from Krafton put the game up on closer to 5 million, majorly undershooting their goal. Callisto also had a budget of about $150 million in production costs. If each of the 2 million games sold at $69.69, which is industry standard now, I can't fucking believe that, but that's a conversation in and of itself, so maybe some other time. The Callisto Protocol only made about $139,980,000, so they potentially didn't even make their budget back on this game. With this in mind, the staff reduction and major management breaking away suddenly makes a lot more sense. Unfortunate, but big cuts have to be made when you don't earn money. Striking Distance and Krafton are both companies after all. So what does this mean for the franchise? Well, I wouldn't put it past them if they abandoned it altogether. Niche horror games, especially overtly gory ones with science fiction driving the plot, tend not to do well on the typical video game market. Companies like Konami with their Silent Hill franchise, and Frictional Games with their Amnesia franchise, don't typically give their developers huge budgets for their games specifically for this reason. If a game doesn't pull in any money because of wider appeal, their spending money is slashed significantly. As for Striking Distance, with Callisto Protocol being their debut title, this doesn't bode well for this franchise specifically. I can imagine a world where Callisto Protocol ends with Jacob Lee and Mahler dying in the collapse of the prison, and Danny went off to fight in the Star Wars or something, but we'll just never get to see into that world again. Unless a massive retrospective comes out that labels it as a good game and drums up hype for the title again, the most we'll likely ever see out of this world again is in references, or maybe additional media like comic books or graphic novels, a movie or a streaming series, or something like that. That's not to say Striking Distance is giving up, however. From the research I did for this video, I discovered that the developer is actively hiring for a few positions as they prepare for a new title. Listed in their job roles is a lead gameplay animator, where in the description they're looking for help to create a brand new unannounced title to be produced in Unreal Engine 5. So at the very least, Striking Distance is looking to continue making games and put out more remarkable works of art. I'm definitely super hopeful for this, as Callisto was an enjoyable experience for me and I was hooked from the start. The way the staff wrote the characters, designed the scenarios, and created the world really captivated me, and Callisto stands in my top 10 favorite horror games. Even if Striking Distance didn't make a sequel or even a horror game after this, I'll still be following the studio to see what's cooking up next, and these job postings in a landscape where video game layoffs and studio liquidations are becoming more and more frequent gives me hope that something better is on the horizon for all parties involved. That just about does it for me tonight, folks, so thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to stay awesome, be kind and rewind. Have a wonderful night. Excelsior.